Tom over now. Superbloom, looking through the book of Ruth. And last week, Casey walked us through the first chapter. So let me quickly recap what happened in the first chapter so that if you weren't here, you're up to speed. So there was this famine, this big drought in Israel, and a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, they left Bethlehem because of the famine, and they went down to Moab to try to find some food. They end up staying there for about 10 years. While they were there, their two sons marry Moabite women, and then something really bad happens. Elimelech, along with his two sons, they die, and this leaves Naomi and her two Moabite daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, as widows. Then Naomi hears at the end of the chapter that God was providing for the Israelites back in Bethlehem, and so she decides to leave and go back. And she tells Orpah and Ruth, look, y'all need to stay here because I'm going to go back to Israel, and it's going to be very, very difficult for you to remarry if you come back with me. So y'all go back to your families. Orpah does go back, but Ruth refuses to. And Ruth commits herself not just to Naomi, but she actually clearly converts from her pagan religion that the Moabites practiced to become a follower of the one true God. And so Ruth and Naomi, they go back to Bethlehem, and they arrive just as the barley harvest was starting. So Ruth and Naomi are back in Israel, but they're far from out of trouble. See, while there may be a harvest happening around them, Ruth and Naomi have little to no access to this food source. Because look at Ruth and Naomi's situation here. All right, three things that I want you to notice about their situation. One is that they're both widows, right? And now I know that for us as Americans in the 21st century, being a widow may not, that doesn't have the same meaning to us, but being a widow in the ancient Near East was very, very difficult. So while you may think, well, why don't you just get remarried? Well, culturally, it was way more likely that a man would take as his wife a woman who had never been married. So it was really hard to get remarried. And for Naomi, the prospect of remarriage was out of the question because she was too old. But even Ruth, who was young, she was much less likely to be married, for one, because she'd been married before, but also because she was a Moabite, right? And very few Israelite men would want to marry a foreigner. So they're apparently stuck. And you have to remember that as a widow, in most societies in this area, they were patriarchal at this time. So that means that men owned almost all of the land, and in an agricultural-based economy like Israel, land was the major source of a person's wealth and their standing in society. And land was passed from the father to the son with very, very rare exceptions. So Naomi and Ruth are here without husbands, and so they have almost no way of providing for themselves. So they were poor, not just widows, but they're poor. But it's worse than that, because in addition to being widows, Naomi and Ruth were now also childless. And in this culture, the primary purpose of women was seen in marriage as producing children. Hopefully male children, right? Because the male child would be able to inherit the land and to carry on the name of the family. So as poor, childless widows then, Naomi and Ruth would have endured not just poverty, but also shame. Naomi would have probably been considered a disgrace to her family, not for only leaving Israel and going to Moab, but now for having no husband and no children. And Ruth, in addition to being from outside God's chosen people, Israel, she was a Moabite who was an enemy of the Israelites here. And she was a childless widow. So this is where we find Ruth and Naomi at the start of chapter 2. No husband to provide for them or protect them. no son to carry on the family name, on the brink of poverty and starvation, with no hope for the future. Now, as Casey talked about last week, Naomi saw all this, understood what was happening, and it made her angry and bitter towards God. See, rather than turning to God for help and protection, Naomi looked at her circumstances and she blamed God. Like, look at what she said at the end of chapter 1. Naomi says this, "Don't call me Naomi," because Naomi in Hebrew meant pleasant. She told them, "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Y'all, how often do we do that same thing? We look at our misfortunes and we think, why is God letting this happen to me? Or we try to blame God instead of trying to see, how is God at work in this? Or where did I go wrong and God is trying to bring me back to Him? Because you see, Naomi had forgotten some important truths about God that I want to share with you tonight. Look at what David says about God. In Psalms 68, David says this about God: "A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in His holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families, and He leads out the prisoners with singing." So God is described here by King David and in multiple other places in the Old Testament as a defender of widows. Right? You see, when God gave the law of the Old Covenant to Moses, He knew how the culture was going to be and how they would think of and mistreat widows. So God made several specific laws to provide for widows, orphans, and the poor, along with very harsh punishments for people who would mistreat them. Look at one of these. In Exodus 22 talks about this. God commands Moses, "Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, because you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Then your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless." And one of the laws that God put in place to help orphans, widows, and the poor is especially important for us tonight as we read Ruth 2, because we're going to see Ruth accessing that right away. In Deuteronomy, God gives a special command to the Israelites as they're about to enter the promised land. In Deuteronomy 24, He says this: "When you are harvesting in your fields and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." Okay, so the way barley was harvested, right? I know not a lot of y'all are barley harvesters. It was cut by a worker with a scythe. I think I've got a picture of it. Yeah, it was cut by a worker with a scythe, and then it was gathered together in bundles. But because, as you see, it's this like long stalk like grass, the sheaves of barley would constantly be, getting dropped, and they'd be, tying them up, and then as they moved them, stuff would fall out, and you could see it, lying around on the ground a lot. So as these dropped sheaves, God had commanded the Israelites, leave those behind. Don't go back and try to sweep up all the stuff that you missed, because I'm using that so that the poor and the needy, like widows and orphans, could have a way to go and gather those up and provide grain for themselves. So back to our story, now that we got some context for what's about to happen. Despite the fact that Naomi has given up on God, God hasn't given up on Naomi or on Ruth. So let's see what happens. So now jump into chapter 2. Beginning in verse 2, we see this. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I found favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. So now that we know what that law was, right? Here we see Ruth accessing God's provision in the law, right? And this was one very clear, immediate way that we see God directly providing for Ruth and for Naomi, right? So one truth that I want y'all to learn tonight about God through these passages is that God provides through his law, right? For us, that would be his word, the Bible. God provides for us through his word, through the law, through the Bible. God gives us his word to help us and to comfort us in our times of trouble. And his commands help us to know how we should live so that we can keep ourselves from the hurt that comes from living outside the way that God has a plan for our lives. And through this provision in God's law, Ruth has a very profitable day in the field. In chapter 2, verse 17, it says that Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley that she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah, right? I know y'all don't have your ephah measurement out. So an ephah of barley is about 5.5 gallons of processed barley. A little bit of context. This is about the amount of grain that would be equivalent to about 10 days worth of food. And to put this in further perspective, she got this in one day. Given what we know about ancient agricultural practices in the area, Ruth being able to glean 5.5 gallons of barley is astounding, right? This is actually much more than even a paid harvester who's getting paid to get the first harvest would have been expected to get as an individual in one day. So how could this be? How was Ruth able to go behind and pick up scraps and get this much? God's provision in the law was just to leave behind the corners of the field and anything dropped. So something beyond just the rote application of the law must be going on here. And we see that actually when Ruth comes home with this huge amount of grain, right? Jumping to the end of the chapter, Naomi, her mother-in-law, knew something was up because she freaks out. And so in verse 19, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed is the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth says, Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." All right, so this helps to explain it a little bit here, right? This huge harvest that Ruth was able to get beyond what the law would have required is because there was someone else involved, right? Okay, now we get a new person into our story named Boaz. So who's this Boaz guy, right? He seems important. So let's back up to the beginning of Ruth 2 and read a little bit more. All right, in Ruth 2, verse 3, it says this. So Ruth, went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, before we get to Boaz, notice the wording here. The author of the book of Ruth, who some think it might have been Samuel, he uses the ancient Hebrew phrase, kira mikre, which is translated here as, "it turned out," right? But this wording, just like any story that you might read when someone says, "it just so happened," or "coincidentally," right? The fact that the author is saying this, pointing this out, means that this wasn't a coincidence, right? This wasn't a coincidence. This was God's providence. Because check this, y'all. Not only does God provide for us through his law, through his word, through the Bible, but we now see that God also provides for us through his people. Okay, so apparently this guy Boaz must be pretty important, right? So what do we know about him? Well, we were told already in that verse that he was from the same clan or family as Elimelech. That's Naomi's husband, former husband. And in verse 1 of Ruth 2, it tells us that he was a relative specifically on her husband's side. Now, Naomi was a relative on her husband's side. A man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. All right? So he's part of their extended family, but it's more than that, right? Because of what it says there. Along with being a relative, we're told here that he is a man of standing, which can be translated, the Hebrew here is a little bit tricky, and be translated a couple of ways. It could mean, as it says, a man of standing. It could mean a man of great wealth. It can mean a man of great power. And as we'll learn as we read through this, and Tom will talk us more through Boaz and what he does in chapters 3 and 4, we'll learn that all of those things, all of those meanings are true here of Boaz. Boaz clearly is rich and influential, right? He owns these fields. He's not out working them. These people all work for him. But rich people, right, as you might know, are often the most oppressive of the poor and the helpless. So is that what Boaz is? No, it's actually very much the opposite. So let's read on so that we can see who Boaz was through his character. In verse 4, it says this. So just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvester, "Who does this young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." And she came to the field and has remained here from morning till evening, from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz goes and talks to Ruth himself, and he says, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work with me. Watch the field that the men are harvesting. Follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you're thirsty, just go and get you a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So we get a glimpse here of Boaz's character. He sees this woman in need, and he doesn't run her off. But he knows God's law and decides to follow God's law that allows her to glean in the fields. And remember what Casey told us last time about the time period that we're in right now, the period of the judges. And during this time, in Judges 21:25, it says this: "In those days," the period that we're in right now, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. And this is the same wording that Deuteronomy 12 uses when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, when they weren't worshiping God and they weren't following his law. And it says, instead, everyone just did whatever they wanted, right? So seeing that Boaz actually does follow what was commanded in the law and allows Ruth to get the leftover grain is already saying something, right? He's a man of God. He's a man that follows God's word. Especially, too, since she's a foreigner, right? From Moab, one of the Israelites' enemies. But we'll see that Boaz goes much beyond this, right? Because he also tells her, "Yeah, come right up and work alongside the women that work for me," right? And get you a drink whenever you need it. And look, at lunchtime, he does this. In verse 14, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. And she ate all she wanted and had some left. So he provides lunch for her. All right, and don't miss that, right? Because Ruth and Naomi have absolutely nothing at this time, right? They had just got back into Bethlehem after being gone for 10 years. So Ruth probably wouldn't have even had any food to eat until after she was able to process the grain that she was getting that day. right? Then after lunch, look at how much further Boaz goes, right? Ruth gets up and she leaves. She's out of earshot. And so Boaz says this. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her. Again, we see him going past the requirements of the law. Boaz now shows his further generosity and desire to help Ruth by telling his men to let Ruth gather even from the main harvest, even from what they haven't left behind yet. And he tells them to even purposely be bad at harvesting, drop stuff on purpose, give big loads of grain that she can pick up, drop handfuls of barley so that she can get them. And as we saw a moment ago, it's with that help that she's able to glean even more than one of the paid workers would have gotten. All right, so now I know what some of y'all might be thinking, right? Ruth must be super hot, right? Because all she does is just show up, and Boaz is like, whoa, who's the new girl, right? And then starts giving her presents and invites her to lunch, right? So we don't know, right? I don't want to burst your bubble, but we aren't told anything about attraction here being Boaz's motivation. Instead, the motivation we are told for Boaz's actions reveal even more about his character and about Ruth's. So we see this when because Ruth asked him, like, why are you doing this? So let's look at this in verse 10. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground after, Boaz was letting her do all these things. And she has said to him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Then Boaz tells her, so here's the reason for all this. I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people that you didn't know before. And may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So Boaz tells her, right, my motivation for doing this is the kindness that Ruth had shown by taking care of Naomi, and the faith that she had shown by leaving her family and their religion behind and placing her faith in God. So beyond the provisions of the law, God had purposely sent Boaz to help Ruth and Naomi in their time of need. Along with providing for us through the law or through the Bible, we see here God also provides for us through his people. But God's plan with Boaz will go much further than just being kind and providing some free food and access to grain. Because you see, we need to actually know a little bit more, one more thing about Boaz and one more thing about God's law to fully understand what God is doing with all this. So let's go back to when Ruth got home and was telling Naomi what all had happened. So Ruth told her mother-in-law in verse 19. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today was Boaz, she said. And look at what Naomi does here. The Lord, Yahweh, that's the covenant name for God. The Lord Yahweh bless him. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, he, meaning God, not Boaz here, he, meaning God, he has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. So when Naomi hears about who had done all these wonderful things for Ruth, for the first time since losing her husband and losing her two sons, we see the beginnings of a change of attitude for Naomi. Naomi blesses Boaz in the name of Yahweh, the covenant name of God. And this is way beyond, way far away from the attitude in chapter 1 that we saw that Naomi says, back to 1:21, where she says, the Lord, using Yahweh again, the covenant name of God, the covenant God has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune on me. Now she's using God's name to bless someone else because she sees what God is doing. And the reason for this change of attitude is because, as she explains to Ruth, Boaz isn't merely just a nice person. He's not merely just a rich relative, but he is the ancient Hebrew word, a Gaal. And a Gaal here is translated and often is as a kinsman redeemer. Okay? And I know that doesn't mean anything to us. So we have to know, what the heck is a kinsman redeemer? Remember what I was saying earlier about God is the defender of widows, the orphans, and the poor. Because in addition to the law which allowed Ruth to glean behind the harvesters, God had set up an even greater protection for the destitute. One of the most important of these laws was the institution of the kinsman redeemer, the Gaal. The kinsman redeemer under the Mosaic law was this. It was a male relative who could redeem a relative in need. Right? The kinsman redeemer had the responsibility of redeeming, that's literally buying back. Right? So if someone was poor in these times, they would often have to sell their land. Right? The most important possession that they had. So the kinsman redeemer could come and buy back, redeem that land for them. If someone was so poor that they had to sell themselves or one of their family members as a slave to work for someone, the kinsman redeemer could come and redeem and buy back that family member from slavery. And most importantly, for our study of Ruth here, is that the kinsman redeemer could specifically help a widow through what is called levirate marriage. So what the heck is that? This is when the kinsman redeemer would marry the widow of his close family member, which would provide her a home, provide her financial support, and provide protection for this widow. But also, and this is important, since property was passed from father to son, and the name of a father being kept in the record was very important to the Hebrews and because of what God was doing in the law. The kinsman redeemer, when he takes the wife, the widow as his wife, the firstborn son would receive the inheritance of his dead father. And he would carry on the name of his dead father, not of the kinsman redeemer. So now we can understand a little bit more about why Naomi was so overjoyed here at hearing that Ruth had been treated well by Boaz. It's because she did know Boaz was a possible kinsman redeemer. And through this, she finally got a glimpse of what God might be doing in her situation. She finally got a glimpse that God was providing for her and Ruth in this distress. Providing for them not only for them through his law, but also specifically through people. So let me ask you, what about you? As Tillman comes up and we start to move into this time of application, what about you? You may be here tonight and feel like Naomi and Ruth. Are you like these widows going through a very tough time in life, right? Because maybe you're not a widow, but maybe you've experienced the loss of a parent or of a family member. And you just don't know how to cope with that. Maybe your parents are getting divorced or already are, and you think, I've lost my family forever. Maybe you had to move, right? And you were forced to leave all of your friends behind. And now you're starting out in a new town and a new school, and you think, I'll never have friends again. If you're feeling like Naomi and Ruth tonight, don't react like Naomi at the beginning of that we talked about. Don't give up hope when you can't see God's plan. Trust in God and in His provision. Know that God is a defender of widows, and God cares deeply about you. Know that His plans are so much bigger and so much better than you can see at this moment. Know that God always provides, both through the law, His Bible, and through people, Christians. And hold on to that promised hope that we have in God. Just like our illustration of the Superbloom that Tom was talking about. You may be in that desert time right now, but know that God has the seeds of His flowers right below the surface. Just wait on Him to send the rain. Or maybe tonight things are going pretty well. Maybe tonight you're like, I don't connect with that. I don't feel like a widow. Maybe you've been blessed. Things are going great for you. So then be like Boaz. Be part of God's provision for those in need. Have your eyes open to see the people and the needs around you. Be willing to use those blessings and the position that God has divinely given you right now to help those in need around you. So who do you see that's hurting? Who do you see that needs a friend? Who do you see that needs a word of encouragement? Who needs you to come alongside of them and show them God's love? Be Boaz tonight. Be the rain on someone else's desert that will bring those flowers into bloom. Be their kinsman redeemer. Let's pray. Dear Father, thank you for this encouragement tonight. Thank you for this example that you give us in Scripture of people going through hard times. Thank you that you know what it means to go through hard times. Thank you for coming and experiencing every bit of life on this earth, every bit of rejection, every bit of loss that we could ever go through as a human, you went through. And God, I just pray for these students tonight that are in that time of drought, that are in that time where they feel like everything is hopeless. God, please touch that student tonight. Help them to feel your love. Help them to know the truth that you have provided already for them through your word. But also, God, we pray for people to come alongside of them and be a Boaz in their life. God, please help these students tonight to choose to be that Boaz for someone else, to use the blessing that you have given them to bless someone else. God, help them to see that, to know that that's what you've got them in this position for. That's why they saw that person. God, please bring this message down deep in their hearts so that those of them right now that don't feel like they're going through anything bad, that when those days come, that they'll remember these words. And God, we'll thank you and give you all the praise and glory for it. Amen.